The sunlight in Boston was sharper than the grey, filtered dawn of England, cutting across the polished cedar desk with a clarity that left no room for shadows. Lady Elena Whitmore, though the men in the bustling counting-house simply called her Captain Whitmore, did not hesitate as she dipped her quill into a crystal inkwell. The rhythmic scratch of the nib against the heavy parchment was the only sound in the room, save for the distant, rhythmic thrum of the harbour she now commanded. She was no longer draped in the restrictive silks of a duchess. Today, she wore a tailored coat of deep charcoal, her sleeves pushed back to reveal wrists that had grown strong from hauling ledgers and navigating the maps of a new world. The logic gap of her previous life had been filled with the solid weight of industry. Elena reached for a heavy brass seal. It did not bear the Ravenshire lions or the crest of a noble house that had ignored her for half a decade. Instead, it was engraved with a simple, soaring albatross circling a compass rose. She pressed the seal into a pool of crimson wax at the bottom of the document, her hand steady and devoid of the tremors that had once haunted her at the Ravenshire breakfast table. The document was not a letter or a ledger entry. It was a formal petition for dissolution of marriage. "Is it done, Captain?" The voice belonged to her lead clerk, a man who had seen her build a shipping empire from the ghost of a liquidated emerald necklace. He didn't look at her with the wall of judgment gaze of the Ravenshire servants. He looked at her with the hardened respect of a partner. "It is," Elena replied, her voice carrying a resonance that was entirely new. "The Duke of Ravenshire is a man of logic. He will understand that a contract with no investment is a contract that has defaulted." She looked out the window at the forest of masts in the harbour, her eyes finding the flag of the Silver Flash. She had outgrown the title of Duchess, as one outgrows a pair of tight, pinching shoes. She wasn't running anymore, she was establishing a perimeter. By sending this summons across the Atlantic, she wasn't just asking for her freedom, she was daring the man who had ignored her to finally look at the cost of his silence. As the wax cooled, she felt the final thread of the gilded cage snap. She wasn't a ghost in a manor anymore. She was a sovereign of the sea, and if Adrian Ravenshire wanted to find her now, he wouldn't be looking for a wife. He would be looking for a rival who had already moved far beyond the reach of his name. The arrival of the post from the colonies was usually a matter of trade routes and timber prices, but the thick, cream-colored envelope that landed on the silver tray this morning carried a different kind of weight. Adrian sat in the study of Ravenshire Hall, the same room where he had once spent years buried in ledgers while his wife became a stranger. The air was still, yet it felt as though the very stones of the manor were holding their breath. Thomas stood at the door, his posture a rigid line of blue wool. Behind him, the wall of judgment had reformed in the corridor, a phalanx of maids and footmen who had perfected the art of appearing invisible while seeing everything. They weren't there to serve, they were there to witness. Adrian broke the crimson wax seal. The albatross and compass rose stared back at him, a sigil he had come to recognize from his own private investigations. As he unfolded the parchment, the smell of salt and cedar, Elena's new scent, seemed to bloom in the stagnant English air. His eyes skipped over the formal legal jargon until they hit the phrase that made the room tilt: dissolution of marriage. The emotional shock was a physical blow, a cold blade sliding between his ribs. He had spent a year writing letters of apology, of growth, of desperate hope. He had imagined their distance as a temporary chasm he was slowly bridging with ink. He had never imagined she would pick up a saw and cut the bridge from her side entirely. "Your Grace," Thomas's voice was a low, steady anchor. Adrian looked up, his face as pale as the linen map he still kept in his breast pocket. He could feel the eyes of the servants on him, the people who had helped her escape, the people who had cheered for her independence in the silence of their hearts. They were waiting to see the old Duke. They expected him to roar, to summon his solicitors, to invoke the king's law to chain a woman who had already sailed across the stars. He looked down at the signature. Elena Whitmore, no Duchess, no Ravenshire, just a name that belonged to her and her alone. The silence stretched, heavy and agonizing. Adrian didn't reach for his bell to summon the lawyers. Instead, he slowly folded the papers and tucked them into his coat, right next to the wooden horse. He stood, his knees momentarily weak, but his gaze remained fixed on the horizon through the window. "Prepare my trunks, Thomas," Adrian said, his voice a jagged whisper that carried more authority than any shout. "And book passage on the swiftest vessel leaving Bristol. I am not sending a solicitor to Boston. I am going myself." A soft, collective exhale rippled through the staff in the hallway. For the first time in his life, Adrian didn't see judgment in their eyes. He saw a flicker of something far more terrifying: expectation. He wasn't going to fight her for her title. He was going to fight for her respect, and the stakes were higher than any kingdom he had ever ruled. The Bristol docks were a churning cauldron of soot, salt, and desperation, a world away from the manicured gravel drives of Ravenshire Hall. Adrian stood amidst the chaos, a single trunk at his feet, watching the grand passenger liners, vessels with velvet-lined cabins and private galleys, steam toward the horizon. For a moment, the habit of a lifetime pulled at him. His title demanded a suite, a steward, and the insulated silence of the elite. Instead, he turned his back on the luxury and walked toward the Iron Gull, a weathered merchant brig that smelled of wet hemp and raw timber. "Name," the purser grunted, not looking up from a grease-stained ledger. "Adrian Hill," he replied, the lie feeling heavy and strange on his tongue. He chose his mother's maiden name, stripping away the Duke and the Ravenshire until he was nothing more than a man with a ticket and a destination. The purser glanced at Adrian's hands, too soft for a laborer, and then at his coat, which was of fine wool but plain and unadorned. With a shrug, he jerked a thumb toward the steerage deck. "Bunk 42, mind your purse and stay out of the sailor's way." The transition into the belly of the ship was a descent into a new reality. The cabin was a cramped, swaying cavern of low-slung hammocks and the communal heat of 50 other men. There was no wall of judgment here, only the raw, unfiltered curiosity of the displaced. Adrian sat on the edge of his narrow bunk, the rough canvas scratching against his palms, and realized with a jolt of hollow shock that he was living the very life Elena had inhabited for years, one defined not by who he was, but by the space he occupied. As the ship cleared the harbor, the violent heave of the Atlantic began to make itself known. While the passengers on the upper decks likely sipped brandy to settle their nerves, Adrian climbed to the main deck, gripping a salt-crusted rail as the spray bit into his face. He watched the sailors work with a rhythmic, mathematical precision that reminded him of the ledgers in Elena's secret office. He found himself watching the way the wind caught the sails, trying to see the invisible lines of force she had mastered. He ate hardtack and watered-down grog, his stomach churning not from the sea, but from the realization of his own previous blindness. For 5 years, he had looked at the world from the top down. Now, staring up at the towering masts from the spray-slicked deck, he finally understood the logic gap of his marriage. He wasn't just traveling to Boston, he was traveling out of his own shadow. He was learning that the world Elena had chosen was not a place of escape, but a place of terrifying, beautiful clarity, and for the first time in his life, he was curious to see if he was strong enough to survive it. The Boston skyline rose out of the morning mist, not as a colonial outpost, but as a towering cathedral of commerce. As the Iron Gull maneuvered toward the crowded piers, Adrian stood among the common travelers, his face weathered by salt and his hands coarsened by weeks of Atlantic wind. He looked for the familiar insignias of the Crown or the established trading houses of London, but as the fog lifted, he saw only one name dominating the horizon. It was stamped in bold, white letters on the sides of towering grain elevators. It was carved into the stone lintels of the massive warehouses lining the waterfront. It flew on sapphire blue pennants from the masts of every third ship in the harbor. Whitmore Shipping. Adrian stepped off the gangplank, his boots hitting the American soil with a heavy, hollow thud. The city did not move with the polite, measured pace of London. It roared with a frantic, industrial energy. He walked through the shadows of the Whitmore docks, watching hundreds of men in leather aprons move crates with a synchronized efficiency that made his own estate management look like a child's game. He stopped before a 3-story brick building that sat at the apex of the wharf. It was the nerve center of the district, and above its arched entrance hung a massive clock flanked by 2 carved albatrosses. Below the clock, a brass plaque glowed in the sharp sunlight, E. Whitmore, director. The retention spike hit him with the force of a tidal wave. He realized that the freedom fund he had tracked in England hadn't just been a nest egg, it had been the seed of an empire. In Ravenshire, Elena had been a ghost in the background of his life. Here she was the very heartbeat of the city. Every carriage that rattled past, every crane that groaned under the weight of iron, every man who checked his pocket watch, they were all moving to the rhythm of his wife's ambition. Adrian felt the logic gap of his journey widen into a chasm. He had come here thinking he was a duke arriving to collect a wayward duchess, but as he stood in the shadow of her name, he realized he was merely a nameless traveler standing in the kingdom of a queen. The summons for divorce wasn't a plea for escape, it was a notice of eviction. She didn't need his money, his protection, or his name. She had built a world where Ravenshire was just a word, while Whitmore was the law. For the first time, the weight of his task felt impossible, for how do you win back a woman who has already inherited the earth? Adrian moved through the crowded streets of the Docklands like a ghost in his own nightmare. To get closer to the center of the storm, he had taken a room at a modest inn frequented by sailors, keeping his head down and his hood pulled low. He found himself drawn to the Exchange, a grand, marble-pillared hall where the elite of Boston gathered to trade news and influence. It was here, from the shadows of a mezzanine gallery, that he finally saw her. Elena entered the hall not as a guest, but as the guest of honor. She was radiant, dressed in a gown of deep emerald silk that caught the light of the massive chandeliers, her movements possessing a fluid, predatory grace that made the room part before her. But she was not alone. At her side walked a man who radiated the kind of easy, sun-bathed power that Adrian had never possessed. He was tall, with the broad shoulders of a man who had worked his own ships and the sharp, intelligent eyes of a statesman. Adrian recognized him from the whispers in the inn, Julian Vane, a merchant prince and a rising star in the local government. The tension in the air was palpable as Julian leaned in, his hand resting with a familiar, protective weight on the small of Elena's back. He wasn't looking at the ledgers or the maps. He was looking at her with a raw, undisguised admiration that made Adrian's blood run cold. Elena didn't flinch or pull away. She smiled, a genuine, sparking smile that Adrian realized he had never once seen in 5 years of marriage. As the music began, a slow, rhythmic waltz, Julian led her onto the floor. They moved in perfect symmetry, a pair of sovereigns surveying a kingdom they had built together. The audience in the gallery whispered of a perfect match, of a wedding that would unite the two most powerful shipping lines in the Americas. Adrian gripped the cold stone railing of the gallery, the happy ending instinct he had nurtured on the Atlantic shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces. He had come here to prove he had changed, but he realized with a sickening jolt that he wasn't just competing with his own past. He was competing with a future that already looked complete without him. Julian Vane didn't ignore her, he championed her. He didn't need to be taught to see her. He had recognized her worth the moment she stepped off the silver flash. Watching them glide across the floor, Adrian felt the logic gap turn into a chasm of pure, unadulterated jealousy. He wasn't the protagonist of this story anymore. He was the villain of the prequel, a shadow lurking in the rafters, while the woman he loved danced with a man who deserved her. The stakes had shifted from a legal dissolution to a battle for a soul that might already belong to someone else. The pride that had once defined Duke Adrian Ravenshire did not break. It transformed into a quiet, focused humility. To understand the woman he had lost, he knew he could no longer view her from the heights of a gallery or the distance of a dock. Using the name Adrian Hill and the meticulous mathematical skills he had once used to manage a duchy, he secured a position as a junior manifest clerk in the very heart of the Whitmore shipping headquarters. The office was a cathedral of industry, humming with the scratch of pens and the frantic energy of a world in motion. From his cramped desk in the corner of the great hall, Adrian watched the Queen of the Docks operate. He saw her navigate the complex mathematics of international trade with a brilliance that left the senior clerks stammering. She didn't just manage assets, she understood the invisible currents of the world. But the true emotional arc occurred in the quiet moments between the grand deals. One rainy Tuesday, a grizzled stevedore entered the office, his cap clutched in trembling hands, speaking of a cargo accident that had cost him his livelihood. Adrian expected a cold, administrative dismissal, the kind of efficiency he had once practiced at Ravenshire Hall. Instead, Elena rose from her desk. She didn't call for a manager. She walked to the man, her presence commanding yet infinitely soft. She didn't offer him a pittance of charity. She offered him a new role in the warehouse and a direct line of credit for his family's medical needs. She remembered his name. She remembered his children. "Efficiency without empathy is merely arithmetic, Mr. Miller," she told the man, her voice carrying a warmth Adrian had never permitted himself to hear. "We are a fleet. We do not leave our own behind." Watching her from behind a stack of shipping ledgers, Adrian felt a searing ache in his chest. He saw the loyalty she inspired in the men who moved her mountains of iron and silk. She wasn't just a mogul. She was a leader who built her empire on the foundation of the very humanity he had spent years suppressing. He realized then that his letters from England had been hollow. He had written of his own growth, but he had never truly grasped hers. She hadn't just built a company, she had built a community where every person was seen, the very thing he had denied her for 5 years. As he dipped his pen into the ink to record a shipment of tea, Adrian didn't feel like a duke in disguise. He felt like a student of a life he was only just beginning to understand, a man watching the sun rise on a world he wasn't sure he was worthy to inhabit. The logic gap of Adrian's disguise collapsed on a humid Thursday afternoon. He was hunched over a ledger of Baltic hemp, his ink-stained fingers moving with a rhythm that had become his only solace, when the frantic humming of the great hall suddenly died. The silence was instantaneous, a vacuum of sound that pulled his gaze upward. Elena was standing at the edge of his desk. She didn't look like a woman who had been deceived. She looked like a woman who had been waiting for the inevitable. The sharp Boston sun caught the silver pins in her hair, casting a halo that made her seem more like an apparition than a merchant queen. Behind her, Julian Vane watched with a narrowed, protective gaze, his hand resting instinctively on his cane. "The numbers for the Bristol run are impeccable, Mr. Hill," Elena said, her voice a calm, low vibration that vibrated in Adrian's marrow. "But your penmanship has always been distinctive. It belongs to a man who spent his youth signing the decrees of a duchy, not the manifests of a merchant." Adrian stood, the rickety chair scraping against the floorboards like a scream. He stripped away the laborer's cap, exposing the face of the man who had ignored her for 5 years. He expected a scene fury, a public denouncement, or perhaps the cold satisfaction of seeing him reduced to a clerk. Instead, Elena simply gestured toward the private inner sanctum of her office. "Come, the tea is fresh, and the air in the hall is far too thin for what remains to be said." Inside, the office smelled of the sea and expensive tobacco. A silver tray sat on the desk, holding a single steaming cup and a folded document. Elena didn't sit. She stood by the window, looking out at the harbor she had conquered, while Adrian stood in the center of the room, feeling the crushing weight of his own insignificance. "I didn't come to stop the shipping, Elena," Adrian whispered, his voice sounding small in the vastness of her success. "I know why you came, Adrian. You came to see if the ghost you left behind was still haunting the halls," she said, turning to face him. Her expression wasn't one of hatred, but of a devastating clinical pity. She reached for a long, elegant fountain pen, the kind used for grand treaties, and placed it atop the petition for dissolution. "You have spent weeks watching me. You have seen that I am not a bird in a cage, nor am I a piece of furniture in a manor." She pushed the paper toward him. The high stakes of the moment were not in the legalities, but in the silence. "You wrote that you wanted to see me. Well, look," she commanded softly. "And then, sign. Julian is waiting to take me to the governor's gala, and I find I have very little patience left for the past." The pen felt like a lead weight. Adrian looked from the document to the woman who had become a titan in the time it had taken him to learn her name. The shock wasn't that she had caught him. It was that she was offering him the one thing he had always denied her, a choice. But as his fingers hovered over the line, he realized that signing didn't just end a marriage, it ended the only version of himself that had finally learned how to love her. The silence in the office was a living thing, thick with the scent of salt air and the finality of the ink cooling in the well. Adrian looked down at the petition, the legal death warrant of a union that had never truly lived. Julian Vane hovered near the door, a silhouette of modern success waiting to reclaim the woman at the window. The world expected Adrian to sign, to preserve his dignity, return to his hollow title, and fade into the history of a century that no longer needed him. Slowly, Adrian laid the pen back on the mahogany. He did not push the paper back. He simply stepped away from it. "I will not sign, Elena," he said, his voice stripped of its ducal resonance, leaving only the raw, honest vibration of the man he had become on the steerage deck of the Iron Gull. Elena turned, her brow arching in a flare of the old, cold fire. "Pride, Adrian, even now, you would remain my jailer out of some archaic sense of possession." "Not your jailer," Adrian countered, meeting her gaze with a steadiness that made Julian shift uncomfortably in the shadows. "And not your duke. I have spent a month in your great hall. I have seen the way you balance the lives of 500 families against the tides. I have seen that your mind is the finest instrument of commerce I have ever encountered." He took a step forward, his ink-stained hands open and empty. He didn't offer her the Ravenshire jewels or the promise of a refurbished manor. "I don't offer you a reconciliation of the heart, not yet. I know I haven't earned that. I offer you a reconciliation of the ledger. You need someone who understands the British timber tariffs, someone who can navigate the House of Lords to open the ports your fleet requires. You need a clerk who knows the enemy's terrain." Elena's eyes narrowed, searching his face for the logic gap of a hidden motive. "You want a job, Adrian. You want to be a servant in the house you once thought you owned." "I want to be useful to you," Adrian said, the transformation finally complete. The man who had once demanded his tea at a certain temperature was gone, replaced by a man who understood that value was something created, not inherited. "Keep the petition in your desk. If after 6 months my labor has not added to the strength of your name, I will sign it myself. But until then, let me work. Let me prove that I can be a man who builds beside you, rather than a man who stands in your light." Julian made a move to speak, but Elena raised a sharp, commanding hand. She looked at the Duke, the nameless traveler, the junior manifest clerk, and for the first time, the clinical pity in her eyes flickered. It was replaced by a dangerous, calculating curiosity. She didn't smile, and she didn't offer her hand. She simply gestured toward the ledger on her desk. "The Bristol manifests are due by dawn, Mr. Hill," she said, her voice like velvet-wrapped iron. "Don't be late." The transition from Duke to Clerk was not merely a change in title, but a hunning of the senses. Adrian had spent weeks in the low hum of the counting house, but the peace shattered on a Tuesday night when the docks erupted in the orange glow of a sudden, unnatural fire. A rival syndicate, desperate to break Whitmore Shipping's stranglehold on the Atlantic, had moved from the shadows of the courtroom to the violence of the piers. Adrian was at his desk, buried in timber tariffs, when the first explosion rocked the wharf. He didn't flinch. He moved with the cold, tactical precision of a man bred for command. While the other clerks descended into panic, Adrian grabbed a lantern and sprinted toward the director's office. He found Elena standing by the window, her silhouette framed by the flickering flames, consuming one of her smaller brigs. "It's a blockade," she said, her voice tight with a rare flash of vulnerability. "They've blocked the channel with a scuttled barge. My fleet is trapped, and they're coming for the warehouses." Adrian stood beside her, his mind automatically shifting into a strategist's gear. He saw the logic gap in the enemy's assault. "They expect you to defend the gate," he said, his eyes scanning the harbor maps. "They think you'll stay on the defensive, but you have a shallow draft steamer in slip 4. It's not a merchant ship, it's an icebreaker." He didn't ask for permission. He began barking orders to the frightened guards, his voice regaining the iron authority of the Ravenshire name. He directed a diversion at the main warehouse while he led a skeleton crew toward the steamer. They didn't move as merchants, they moved as a boarding party. The sabotage was surgical, but Adrian was a surgeon of a different sort. He used the steamer to ram the scuttled barge, leveraging the weight of the tide, a calculation he had practiced on the paper boats of his lonely breakfast table to clear the channel. As the rival ships moved in to finish the job, Adrian signaled the rest of the fleet. Elena watched from the pier as the man she had once dismissed as a stagnant relic coordinated a countermaneuver that was nothing short of brilliant. He didn't just save the cargo, he pinned the rival ships against the breakwater, trapping them in the very net they had cast for her. By the time the sun rose over a charred but victorious harbour, Adrian was covered in soot and seawater, his fine wool coat ruined. He stood on the deck of the steamer, his chest heaving. Elena walked down the pier, the smoke parting for her like a curtain. She didn't thank him for the business. She looked at the man who had used his duke training not to rule her, but to protect what she had built. The stakes had been her empire, but the victory was the look in her eyes, a recognition that he wasn't just a clerk and he wasn't just a ghost. He was the sword she hadn't known she needed. The morning after the harbour fire, the air in Elena's office was scrubbed clean by a brisk Atlantic wind. Adrian sat across from her, his face still marked by the shadow of the night's soot, while the petition for dissolution lay between them, a relic of a war that had finally evolved into a truce. Elena did not reach for the petition. Instead, she drew a fresh sheet of vellum from her drawer. It was not a marriage certificate, nor was it a decree of divorce. It was a partnership agreement, typed with the clinical precision of her shipping manifests. "I have no desire to return to the silence of Ravenshire Hall, Adrian," she said, her voice steady as she dipped her pen. "And I have no intention of being a wife whose primary function is to provide an heir for a line that never saw her. But I cannot deny that your mind for strategy is a match for my own." Adrian watched her, a quiet, profound peace settling over him. He didn't ask for her hand. He didn't beg for the return of the title. He simply reached for the pen when she slid the new document toward him. "I am not looking for a wife, Elena. I am looking for a peer. I would rather be your partner in this port than your master in an empty house." They signed it together, a union of minds rather than of laws. There was no kiss, only a firm, lingering handshake that carried more intimacy than any forced embrace of their previous life. A year later, the wall of silence at Ravenshire Hall was a distant memory. Thomas, the head footman, entered the study with a letter on a silver tray. The envelope was not marked with the royal seal or the heavy crest of a duchess. It bore the albatross and the compass rose. Adrian opened it, his heart hammering with a rhythmic, healthy heat. The letter wasn't filled with the desperate apologies of the past. It was a report on the new trade routes through the Caribbean, followed by a brief, punchy postscript. "The coffee in the port is excellent, but I find the chair beside me remains empty. I expect your report on the timber tariffs by the next tide. Don't be late, partner." Adrian looked at the wooden horse on his desk, its blue mane bright in the English sun. He wasn't a duke waiting for a ghost anymore. He was a man preparing to catch the wind. He began to write back, his hands steady, his heart finally open to a world where love was not a command, but a shared horizon. Should Elena have signed the divorce papers and walked away forever, or is a partnership of equals the ultimate victory? Tell us what you think in the comments.